November 1988, the planned elections went ahead in Pakistan despite the mysterious death in August of President Zia. The winner was Benazir Bhutto, daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had been overthrown and executed by Zia's coup d'etat in 1977. Benazir Bhutto became the first woman to lead a majority Muslim country. Two disasters struck the UK in December. First, the Clapham Junction railway crash, in which one crowded commuter train rear-ended another and hit an empty one coming the other way at one of the busiest junctions in the country. 35 died and nearly 500 were injured in the accident caused by a signalling failure. And then, shortly before Christmas, a Boeing 747 of Pan Am Airways exploded over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing all 259 passengers and crew on board and raining debris on the town, killing a further 11 on Sherwood Crescent, which was hit by a section of wing travelling at over 500 miles an hour. The majority of the passengers on board were American, including a group of students from Syracuse University returning home from an exchange trip. There had been warnings of terrorist attacks before the flight, and indeed Pan Am had increased security, but a bomb had been smuggled aboard. In the coming days, several groups claimed responsibility, but the British security services believed that Libya was to blame. The investigations and court hearings would drag on for over a decade. In the febrile atmosphere, in early January, there was another incident between US Navy and Libyan aircraft over the Gulf of Sidra, with a pair of American F-14 Tomcats shooting down two Libyan MiG-23 floggers that they believed were preparing to attack them. Libya claimed the aircraft were unarmed reconnaissance planes, and while the US released photographs of them carrying anti-aircraft and anti-shipping missiles, they also admitted that the Libyan fighters had never actually activated their radars. Clips of the audio feed from the American fighters were used in the 1992 movie Under Siege. In Japan, the Emperor Showa, better known in the West by his personal name of Hirohito, died at the age of 87. His son Akihito succeeded as the Emperor Heisei. Hirohito was Emperor of Japan throughout the 1930s and 40s era of militarism, expansion, and ultimately war, and General MacArthur's decision in 1945 to allow him to remain on the throne in the interests of peaceful occupation had always been a controversial one. Although he was forced to renounce his divine status and become more of a constitutional monarch, many still thought it was a great injustice that he'd never been indicted for war crimes. His funeral in February would be the first trip abroad for the newly inaugurated President Bush, combining it with visits to China and South Korea. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February, ending the 9-year campaign which had become the Soviet Vietnam, and the US closed its embassy in Kabul, anticipating the fall of the shaky Soviet-aligned government. The Satanic Verses, the fourth novel by Indian-born British author Salman Rushdie, had been attracting controversy for its perceived anti-Islamic blasphemous content since its release in September. The book had been banned in Pakistan, imports banned in India, and demonstrations in the UK saw copies burned in the street. Now, in February 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini, leader of Iran, issued a fatwa, a legal ruling, calling on Muslims around the world to work for the death of Rushdie and his publishers. The British government put him under round-the-clock protection, and Iran broke off diplomatic relations. The military government of Poland opened new talks with the Solidarity Trade Union and started some steps, such as liberalising currency exchange, to bring small measures of economic freedom to the country. Elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, the so-called singing revolution in Estonia continued, with the blue-black-white tricolour flag being flown officially for the first time in 44 years. The Soviet Union agreed to submit to the authority of the United Nations World Court and allowed farmers to lease state-owned farms for life, and there were mass pro-democracy demonstrations in Hungary. And in March, British scientist Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, submitted a memo entitled Information Management, a Proposal, suggesting that the organisation utilise the existing technology of linked computers, he coined the word web for such a network, to improve information sharing. His key idea was what he called hypertext, words in text that when clicked would link you to relevant content in another document. He got little response except from his immediate manager Mike Sendall, who offered him a new workstation to try it out on. It was a new world in F1 too, with turbocharged engines now banned and all teams now being required to have the driver's feet behind the front axle. Most designers simply moved the pedals back a bit, which meant that tall drivers like Gerhard Berger and Eddie Cheever would find their cockpits even more constricted than usual. With the new regulations promising to decrease costs and level the playing field, there had already been an influx of new teams in 1988 in the shape of Rial, EuroBrun, Coloni and Scuderia Italia, and in 1989 the Brabham team would return alongside two new teams, the British Onyx team and the Italian First Racing. With several single-car teams also expanding to two cars, there would now be a whopping 41 cars trying to qualify, meaning Friday morning pre-qualifying had to expand, now with 14 cars competing for just 4 slots in qualifying proper. The 5 cars from new teams, Brabham, Onyx and First, the 4 extra cars from expanded teams, Rial, AGS, Coloni and Scuderia Italia, would join the Zakspeeds, the Osellas, the single EuroBrun, now a 1-car team, and Streff's lead AGS. With so much up in the air, perhaps it was just as well that there was only one change to the calendar from 1988. With the proposed circuit at Belle Isle and Detroit not materialising, the US Grand Prix would move to a new home at Phoenix, Arizona, another street circuit, and swapped slots with the Canadian Grand Prix so that it came a week after the Mexican. Some were a bit unsure about a race in Arizona in June, given the problems with the heat at Dallas in a similar time slot some years earlier. Not to mention that replacing the unloved Detroit track with another right angles and bumps American street circuit wasn't what most people had had in mind. McLaren's domination of 1988 means that the only way is probably down, but that won't stop Ron Dennis and the men from Honda expecting the best. This year's car, the MP45, has a lot to live up to, and the team under chief designer Neil Oatley have worked hard on producing an evolution of the all-conquering MP44, built around Osamu Goto's new Honda V10 engine, with last year's longitudinal Weissman gearbox. On driving duties, the successful partnership of Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost continues, with the Brazilian now taking the lead car as defending champion. Ayrton Senna had looked like a potential champion ever since he arrived in F1, and certainly since winning just his second race for Lotus in his second season in the sport. 1988 had not only cemented his reputation by making him Brazil's third F1 world champion, but had decisively given him bragging rights in his battle with rival Nelson Piquet. Senna had made the Lotus Honda look good, the Lotus Honda made Piquet look ordinary. Senna would look to defend his title from Prost, who would surely be his main rival again. Le Professeur had every right to be disgruntled with the results of the 1988 season. If all his results had counted, he would have won easily. If he is unhappy, though, he hasn't shown it and has welcomed his teammate Ayrton to the fraternity of F1 champions. The relationship between the two men seems good so far, though there were signs at the end of 1988 that under pressure that could change. Once again, Tyrrell's cars start the year devoid of sponsorship, following a pretty indifferent 1988, at least compared with the success of the previous year. Harvey Doc Postlethwaite is again overseeing a new chassis with Jean-Claude Migier on design duties, but it won't be ready for the starting race, so the team persist with the 017 chassis, now updated to B-spec, to comply with the new regulations. In the back is the latest update of the venerable Ford V8 series, the DFR. Exclusive to Benetton in 1988, this has now been made available to all Ford customers. Jonathan Palmer enters his third year with the team, and alongside him is Michele Alboreto, rejoining the team he left for Ferrari at the end of 1983, just as Palmer was making his debut. The ever-cheerful Doctor had made his F1 debut back in 1983, but had bounced around backmarker teams ever since, from Ram to Zakspeed and then Tyrrell, without ever seeming to really shine. He was a quintessential safe pair of hands with lots of testing experience, and for a struggling team you do need someone who'll bring the car home, but a safe reputation will never put you in a top seat. 1987 was a high point as winner of the Jim Clark Cup, while 1988 was dire in the uncompetitive car. The Italian's 5 years with Ferrari had started with such promise, winning his third race for the Scuderia at Zolder in 1984, but just 2 more wins followed, as an early title tilt in 1985 ended in a flurry of retirements, and he never really looked the same driver again. Now, granted, the Ferraris of the following years weren't exactly classics, but tellingly he seemed to often be beaten by his own teammate too, with both Johansson and Berger looking much livelier in the same car. Alboreto will hope that a return to the Tyrrell team that gave him his big break will be a temporary blip, and he'll be back in a top team soon. After a year in the competitive wilderness, Williams have great hope from their exclusive new engines from Renault, back in the sport after a 2-year absence. The team worked hard during 1988 to develop the RS1, a 67-degree V10, in conjunction with the FW12 chassis, and with chief designer Frank Durney moving to Lotus, Argentine Enrique Scalabroni has been brought in to pen a brand new car which will debut later in the season. In the meantime, the FW12C will, the team hope, benefit from the increased power of the Renault compared to last year's Judd V8, and they have chosen not to try again with the reactive suspension. Riccardo Patrese is joined by new signing Thierry Boutsen in the cockpit, with the Red 5 that had become Mansell's trademark recoloured to a simple white. The Belgian had established himself as Mr. Consistency in 1988, finishing third to the two McLarens on 6 occasions and coming fourth in the championship, and top of the non-turbo runners. His patient, methodical style has also made him a valuable driver on testing development duties, but there are still many who feel that he's not yet proven himself a potential winner. Based on 1988's form, moving from Benetton to Williams feels like a demotion, but he will be hoping the form book will go out of the window in 1989. By far the most experienced driver on the grid, Patrese had, at the Australian Grand Prix, equalled Graham Hill and Jacques Lafitte's record of 176 starts, and is set to beat the record in Brazil. His career had seemed about done after 2 difficult seasons with Brabham, followed by high-profile moves to Alfa Romeo, then back to Brabham that both turned sour, and for a while it looked like indifferent form in the Williams might finally finish him off. Rumours swirled for most of the season that he might be dumped in favour of Alboreto, but Frank kept faith, he got the hang of the car, and by the end of the season he was giving the more highly rated Mansell a good race. Brabham make a welcome return to the grid after their absence in 1988 under new management, but still in the white and blue colour scheme that survived their relationship with Parmalat in the early 80s. Former team owner Bernie Eccleston sold the team towards the end of 1988 to Walter Brunn, leading to questions about the EuroBrun team, but Brunn swiftly sold the concern on to fellow Swiss businessman Joachim Luthi, who has put together a team to bring the illustrious name back into F1. John Baldwin and Sergio Rinland have produced the all-new BT58 chassis, mounting the Judd EV V8 engine, a new design with a narrower 76-degree angle compared to the 90-degree CV from 1988. As it happens, Judd Engines had been co-founded by Jack Brabham back in 1971 as Engine Developments, to go with the Motor Racing Developments team name, and the team were one of 2 along with March to get the new engine. In the cockpit, Martin Brundle makes his return to F1 alongside highly rated youngster Stefano Modena. Like the Brabham team, Martin had been out of Formula 1 in 1988, fed up with piloting sluggish Tyrrells and Zakspeeds around the circuit until they inevitably broke down. He went off to join Tom Walkinshaw Racing's Jaguar sports car team, and evidently had a whale of a time, as he won the 1988 World Sports Car Championship and still had time for a guest appearance in F1 for Williams. He'd told interviewers at that race that he'd only return to the Grand Prix scene if he felt the car was competitive, and it seems the new Brabham is good enough to tempt him back. Modena had made his F1 debut in Brabham's last race in 1987, but inexperienced with turbo engines, he had had to pit several times to replace flat-spotted tyres before finally retiring with exhaustion. A fruitless season with EuroBrun had followed, though he comprehensively wiped the floor with Oscar Larus, and even showed a little pace now and then when the car wasn't breaking down. Many still peg Modena as a potential star of the future, and if the Brabham lives up to its potential, this could be the start of something. 1988 had been Arrow's best ever season in terms of final placing, and all concerned were hoping for more of the same at the very least in 1989. Gone are the Megatron-badged BMW turbo engines in favour of the Ford DFR, and Ross Brown and James Robinson have designed a new chassis, the A11, around it, with an in-house gearbox designed with the help of Hewland. Derek Warwick and Eddie Cheever enter the 3rd year of their driving partnership with Arrows, and both men get on famously off the track and race hard on it. The new asymmetric colour scheme has already turned a few heads, and they could be a team to watch in the coming season. Warwick had a good 1988, finishing 7 times in the points, though never quite making it onto the podium as teammate Cheever had. The pair had spent quite a lot of 1988 running together on their own, having a private little race, usually better than the midfield but not quite good enough to challenge the leaders. Derek didn't seem to mind though, and seemed just to be enjoying his racing. The Rome-born American was, like Warwick, enjoying life at Arrows, and had been delighted to end up on the podium in Italy and soak up the atmosphere at that famous Ferrari win. Outside that, his results hadn't been as good as Warwick's, and he'd had the lion's share of the mechanical problems. Like Derek, he was looking forward to a better engine in 1989 without a full second's delay between pressing the pedal and getting some power. By the time Frank Durney had been recruited from Williams to replace the outgoing Gerard Ducarouge, much of the design work on the new Lotus 101 chassis had already been done by chief designer Mike Coughlin. With Honda gone, Lotus are now in the unfamiliar position of being a customer rather than a works team in terms of engine, and the new car would mount the 1988 issue Judd CV. It did at least allow Coughlin to design a much lighter, slimmer car. Indeed, Momo had to make special steering wheels so the drivers could stop scraping their knuckles on the bodywork when they turned. Tuning company Tickford were enlisted to try and massage some more power out of the engine with a bespoke cylinder head. The official line is that this is a new start for Lotus on the way back up to the top, but many are not convinced. Three-time champ he may be, but Nelson Piquet looked distinctly ordinary in 1988, and the critics have been circling. A little harsh perhaps, the car was an absolute dog. He still did much better than Nakajima, and as we now know, he was still suffering the after effects from his Imola crash in 1987. Nonetheless, 3 third places and 4 lower points finishes do not a great title defence make, and he would be under pressure to do better and justify his paycheck in 1989. Lotus's confirmation that Nakajima would continue with the team in 1989 despite Honda's departure raised a few eyebrows. While everyone wished the likeable Japanese driver all the best, it had been widely assumed that he was only there at the behest of Honda and would be out on his ear once they left. This was a bit unfair to Naka, who'd done sterling work with 2 pretty dreadful cars and had made use of his long experience with Honda engines to develop the car, but now he would have to sink or swim on his own merits. The successful March 881 chassis had turned heads in the second half of 1988 with a series of storming drives, particularly by Ivan Capelli, and the team had been rewarded with works status in company with Brabham for the Judd engines, giving them access to the new EV units. A new car was being developed to house it, the CG891. The CG stood for Cesare Garibaldi, a March team manager who'd been killed in a road accident over the winter. The new car wasn't quite ready yet though, so the team would head to Brazil with the 881, still mounting the old CV engine. There was also continuity of drivers, with Gugelmin and Capelli staying with the team, so there were hopes that March could pick up where they left off in 1988. The Brazilian's 1988 season hadn't been as full of fireworks as Capelli's, with just 2 points finishes, but he had been unfortunate to have most of the mechanical bad luck, retiring from 8 of the 16 races. He regularly finished just outside the points in 7th or 8th, but nonetheless ended the season as the highest scoring rookie and had gained good experience of mixing it in the midfield and would hope for better things in 1989. The fun-loving Capelli had developed a reputation both as a practical joker and as an extremely talented driver who had quickly overcome a flutter of imposter syndrome to race at the front with the McLarens as if he'd been there for years. If he could continue his late 1988 form into 1989, then a win looked a distinct possibility. He's clearly enjoying life at March, but whether they'll be able to hold on to him if the big boys come knocking is another matter. Osella begin their 10th season in Formula 1, despite all the odds and with scarce reward from all their effort, save for the joy of just being involved. The team have an all-new chassis to finally replace the variations on the 1983 Alfa Romeo car they've been using, though its designation the FA1M suggested it was only another evolution. In the back was the Ford DFR, and there was an injection of funding from Gabriele Rumi's Fontmetal alloy wheels firm, which paid for the new chassis and an expansion to 2 cars, and team old boy Piercarlo Ginzani returns to the team alongside talented Ferrari test driver Larini. There is reason for optimism at last. The affable Italian had done about as well as could be expected in the aptly named FA1L, qualifying 10 times and only missing out in pre-qualifying once. While he was not able to score points and in fact only finished 3 races, he had attracted favourable comment for his gutsy performances in clearly inferior equipment. He remains favourite to make the most of the new car's potential and has a new helmet design as well in blue and white. Ginzy returns for his 3rd stint at the team, with which he has become somewhat synonymous. At 37 he can't keep this up forever, but he doesn't seem to mind much about results and just enjoys the racing. The question is how much motivation he has to rise to Larini's challenge, and whether the team will expect him to do more than just have a jolly on their Lira. The unofficial Works Ford team had a good 1988 and were hoping to take that next step in 1989 and take their first win since 1986. With Thierry Boutsen underway to Williams, Sandro Nannini moves into the team leader spot and is joined by promising youngster Johnny Herbert. The team will begin the season with their 1988 car while the new model is developed, which will mount a brand new Ford engine. Unfortunately, the new engine doesn't fit in the old car, so Benetton will be starting with the same DFR engine that many of the other teams are now using. How this will affect their performance, how Nannini copes with the pressure of leading the team, and how well Herbert has recovered from his horrific F3000 crash all remain to be seen. Nannini's first year at Benetton had seen the chain-smoking Italian with the rockstar sister make a splash with a series of hard-charging drives. Ultimately, he was probably a bit too hard-charging, having suffered more retirements than Boutsen. He certainly had raw pace, but could be hot-headed and make silly mistakes, and that is something the team will be keen to train out of him. Essex-born Herbert had been a rising star in the British domestic racing scene for some years, coming to wider attention after winning the Formula Ford Festival at Brands Hatch in 1985. He moved into British Formula 3 with Mike Rowe Racing and garnered 8 points from just 6 entries in 1986 before joining Eddie Jordan Racing for the 1987 season, which he won at a canter. Moving up to F3000 for 1988, still with Jordan, he won his first race at Jerez from pole and came third at Monza. But then, at the 7th race, he was involved in a colossal accident that nearly cost him his feet. Benetton had had an option on him, and Frank Williams was apparently at Brands to talk to him too. But Benetton kept faith with him as he recovered and got back into the cockpit. He still has difficulty walking, but both he and the team seem sure he's ready to drive. The Scuderia Italia team had had a decent debut in 1988, not scoring but coming close on a couple of occasions, with a neat chassis manufactured by the experienced Dallara firm from designs by Gianpaolo Dallara himself and Sergio Rinland. With Rinland returning to Brabham, Mario Tolentino had worked on the new car, the F189, which, like many others, would pack the Ford DFR V8 in the back. Things were looking good, and team owner Beppe Lucchini decided to expand to 2 cars, running the experienced and well-funded Andrea de Cesaris in the second car alongside Alex Caffey. After a slow start to the season, Caffey attracted favourable notices in the middle races, with a series of good qualifying runs married to solid, reliable driving that brought the car home as often as he could. Seldom spectacular, not often seen on the TV, but that's not necessarily a bad thing in a new team. He's certainly done his career prospects no harm so far, and we'll be hoping that this car will allow him to show his talent in the season to come. De Cesaris joins his 8th team in his 10th year of Formula 1, a statistic that says as much about his career as any other. His wilder tendencies have largely been tamed these days, but he's not covered himself in glory either, touring around a series of struggling teams bringing Marlboro money and a mostly safe pair of hands. Nonetheless, he'd put in some good shifts in Rial in 1988, coming 4th in Detroit and qualifying for every race, which isn't bad for a new team. Minardi begin the 1989 season exactly where they left off. Pierluigi Martini and Luis Perez Sala will be driving the M188B for the first few races in the season, while Nigel Cooperthwaite, recruited over the winter, puts the finishing touches to the M189 design for later in the year. The old chassis has been amended to obey the new feet behind the axle rule and fit the new Ford DFR, which would also be used in the new car. 1988 hadn't been a classic year for the team, but they had at least scored their first point and would be hoping to build on that success, however minor. Brought in after 5 races of the 1988 season to replace Adrian Campos after 3 DNQs on the bounce, Martini wasted no time making his mark. The rest of the season couldn't quite live up to a point in his first race, but it showed how much he had learned after his less than stellar first attempt in 1985. Now all he had to do was keeping it up in the coming season. He had a long association with the Minardi team and would be looking to repay their faith in him by continuing to produce results for them. The Spaniard had decidedly outshone his compatriot in 1988, but found beating Martini a tougher proposition. He'd finished 8 races out of 6, with the best finish of 8th, and only DNQ'd twice, so he had done enough to retain his place in the team, even as the Spanish Lotus concern reduced their sponsorship money. He would have to make sure that he continued to impress in 1989, but with more competition that wouldn't be easy. One of the few teams who have a new 1989 challenger from the get-go, Ligier were keen to put 1988 behind them and look to the future. The new JS33 chassis, designed by Michel Beaujean with a polish from Richard de Villa, took design cues from the March 881, and indeed the team had purchased March's in-house gearbox to use in the new car too. Gone with the Judd engines as well, with the Ford DFR taking its place, while the team stuck with Goodyear tyres instead of switching to Pirelli. René Arnoux begins his 4th season with the team and is joined by French rookie Olivier Gouillard. By now the old man of the Grand Prix circuit at 41, many believe that Arnoux should have moved over to make way for younger talent years ago. Not only that, but he has also gained something of a reputation as a mobile roadblock, not merely slow, but actively obstructing faster cars from lapping him. Although Gerhard Berger was quick to exonerate Arnoux after they collided in Australia, the fact that it was automatically assumed René was at fault does say a lot. Still, if he can mentor young Gouillard through what may be a trying first season in the sport, he will earn his keep. If. Born near Toulouse in southwest France, Olivier started in go-karting at the age of 14, competing in Volant Elf in 1981 before progressing to Formula Renault in 1982. Winning the title at the first attempt, he moved up into French Formula 3, coming 4th in his first season with the Oreca team, then winning the 1984 title with relative ease. The new F3000 series beckoned in 1985 and he moved with Oreca into the Formula. Here things stalled a little as the car struggled in midfield, and he left Oreca, returned and left again, before finally pitching up with the GBDA motorsport team and coming 2nd in the 1988 series, with 2 wins. This was enough to bring him to the notice of Guy Ligier, looking for a hard-charging French youngster to breathe new life into his team. All change at Ferrari. A mid-season palace coup had continued in the off-season, and when the dust settled there was a new boss, hard-headed former Lancia principal Cesare Fiorio. Out was the demotivated Alboreto, in came hard-charging Nigel Mansell to partner Gerhard Berger, 3 times a winner in trying circumstances in 1987-88. The new car, the Ferrari 640, is John Barnard's first fully new design for the team. Features a chisel nose, wide flowing side pods and a low airbox with intakes either side of the driver's head. In the back is another new development, the Scuderia being one of just 2 engine manufacturers to go with a V12 layout over the V10s and V8s elsewhere on the grid. In fact, the FIA had been reluctant to allow V12s, and Ferrari went as far as constructing the 637 IndyCar spec chassis before the governing body got the message and caved. The new engine develops the same horsepower as its turbo V6 predecessor, but with none of the fuel consumption issues that had so bedeviled the team. Lastly, but certainly not least, an innovative semi-automatic gearbox with almost instantaneous shifts up and down controlled by paddles mounted behind the steering wheel rather than a conventional gear shift. If it works, it could be a major advantage. If not, well, we all remember Williams' reactive suspension last year. Nigel Mansell certainly does. Nigel Mansell has had some really rotten luck the last few seasons, missing out on both the 1986 and 87 titles with a dominant Williams Honda. Despite winning more races than the eventual champion on both occasions, the team then struggled through 1988 with engine overheating, suspension problems and more. It didn't take much for a thoroughly disgruntled Nigel to end his 4-year shift at Williams and move to Italy, and as it turned out, he became the last driver to be personally selected by Enzo Ferrari before his death. Nigel will be looking to recapture his winning ways and justify the late Commendatore's faith in him. Having won 3 times in 2 seasons in what is best described as dodgy machinery, Berger comprehensively demolished Michele Alboreto in the process. Not only did he win 3 times to Alboreto's none, but consistently outqualified, outdrove and outscored his teammate. Whether Berger has the quality to go all the way to the world title remains to be seen, but if the new car goes well, he certainly has the potential to be a real challenger. He retains his previous race number of 28, but may well see himself as team leader now, especially given Mansell's indifferent 1988 season. Messrs Larus and Calmels enter their 3rd season of Formula 1 with an unchanged driver lineup of Alliot and Dalmas. 1988 hadn't been a classic season with a pair of 7th places for Yannick, the high point, but the cars only failed to qualify on 2 occasions, one of which was Pierre-Henri Raffinal's last-minute substitute drive in Australia. For 1989, though, the team would have exclusive use of the new Lamborghini V12 engine designed by ex-Ferrari man Mauro Forghieri. The new power unit's capabilities are still a bit of an unknown quantity, and the new LC89 chassis won't be ready until the European rounds, so the team will take to the track in Brazil with last year's car rear bodywork almost entirely missing to accommodate the big new engine on which so much will depend. Dalmas had had the better season of the 2 drivers in 1988 until his unfortunate bout of Legionnaire's disease put him out of contention for the last couple of races. Despite the disease sometimes causing impaired motor function, Dalmas appears to have made a full recovery and will look forward to getting back in the saddle and continue his battles with Alio in 1989. He had just missed out on points on a couple of occasions in 1988, and he'll be keen to right the record. Alio has been with the team since its inception in 1987 and scored 3 times with them in that first season. Results in 1988 were thinner on the ground, and he retired twice as often as Dalmas, with the best finish of 9th. As the unofficial team leader, he'll hope for 1989 to bring more competitiveness and reliability, as well as re-establishing himself over Dalmas. Enzo Coloni's little squad had mixed fortunes in 1988. Gabriele Tarquini often struggled to qualify, sometimes even to pre-qualify the car, but when he did, he managed to put in some decent drives, the highlight being an 8th place finish in Canada. He may have been dead last and several laps down, but he was still running, which is the main thing. With ex-AGS man Christian van der Plein working on a new chassis, the team will be taken to the track with an updated FC188. Or rather 2, because despite finances continuing to be short, the team have expanded to 2 cars for 1989 with Roberto Moreno and Pierre-Henri Raffinel on driving duties. Competition will be fierce at the bottom end of the grid though, with 14 drivers now in pre-qualifying. The genial Brazilian just hadn't had the breaks in his racing career. After a disastrous substitute appearance for Lotus in 1982, he'd had 2 races as a substitute with AGS in 1987 and even scored a point for them in Australia, but was nonetheless unable to secure a seat in 1988. Instead, he signed a testing contract with Ferrari and returned to Formula 3000, taking 4 wins for the sponsorless Bromley Motorsport team. Even this didn't get the attention of many F1 teams, and it was only through Ferrari's good offices and the good memory of Christian van der Plein that he landed a drive with Coloni. Would this be his last chance to break into F1? Raffinel's sole F1 outing at the last race of 1988 hadn't gone well. Having never sat in an F1 car before landing, he'd then suffered gearbox problems in the Lola and failed to qualify. But he was still highly rated, and with Coloni's new sponsorship from French sports channel La 5, he was able to get himself a seat for the season. As Coloni expand to 2 cars, EuroBrun go the other way, deciding for 1989 to concentrate on just 1 car. Designer George Wrighton is working on a new chassis, but with limited budget, staff and development time, it's not expected until mid-season. In the meantime, the ER188 chassis has been updated to take the Judd CV engine, and the team will just have to make do. With Stefano Modena on his way out to Brabham, the Euro Racing management were also able to get rid of Oscar Laraury, who they'd tried to elbow out mid-season, and in his place comes Swiss rookie Gregor Wojtek. Wojtek Sr. raced Lola sports cars with some success back in the 1970s and was a keen supporter of his son's racing career. Gregor won the Swiss F3 title in 1986 before moving into Formula 3000. His 1987 season was a bit of a bust, but in 1988 with GA Motorsport he took a win at Vallelunga on his way to 7th overall. However, he also came into Formula 1 with a mixed reputation, as a ballsy attacking driver but also one with a wild streak a mile wide. It was his accident that caused the restart during which Johnny Herbert crashed in Brands Hatch in 1988, and Johnny was outspoken in his criticism of Wojtek's driving. Maybe not the safest pair of hands for a single-car backmarker team, but he does come courtesy of a lot of Daddy's money. Zakspeed's 1988 season was the worst of their 3 full seasons in the sport, and their critics wonder why they're persisting into 1989 after deciding not to build their own atmospheric engines following the turbo ban. The replacement engine, the Yamaha OX88, is an unknown quantity, and you have to assume the amount of development and testing the engine and car will get during the season will be pretty minimal. Yamaha have torn it up in motorbike racing, so they do know what they're about, at least. Bernd Schneider sticks with the team, hoping that a year's experience will put him in better stead, and he's joined by Aguri Suzuki, who had done well on his debut with Lola. Unlike many other teams, their new chassis, Gustav Brunner's 891, will be ready for Rio. The West Germans' debut season had been something of a baptism of fire, and with a combination of inferior machinery and greatly increased competition for grid slots, Schneider only qualified for 6 races and only finished 2 of those, 12th in Germany, 14th in Belgium. And to be perfectly honest, unless Yamaha pull something pretty special out of the bag with their new engine, and or Gustav Brunner has drawn a great chassis, he's only going to find it tougher going into 1989. The young Japanese driver had made a good impression in his only race so far, qualifying well and finishing on home territory while deputising for Yannick Dalmas. Having raced at Suzuka, he'd returned to his F3000 berth and secured the Japanese title, so he clearly was in possession of some talent, but having only driven on a circuit he was very familiar with, it was difficult to assess how that would translate into Formula 1, and pessimism suggested that Zakspeed wasn't going to be the place for him to shine. Team principal Mike Earle had extensive experience in open-wheel racing when, in 1978, he approached a former colleague, Greg Field, with a view to starting a new team. The new organisation began the following year by entering a home-brewed chassis in the British Formula 2 series to little avail, and in 1980-81 instead ran modified works marches for Johnny Cicotto and Riccardo Paletti. Then the organisation struck lucky. Robin Herd asked Earle to run the March Formula 2 team in 1983 while they concentrated on F1, so the team built valuable experience, moving into F3000 when this replaced F2 as the primary feeder series. Stefano Modena drove their cars to the 1987 title, but they weren't able to repeat the feat with Volker Weidler the following year. Nonetheless, Earle and co had their sights set on F1, and they seemed to have a good base. A neat chassis drawn by former McLaren man Alan Jenkins, the reliable Ford DFR engine, and a mixture of youth and experience in the shape of rookie Bertrand Gachot and Stefan Johansson on driving duties. Coming with Gachot was his sponsor, eccentric Belgian millionaire Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, who initially provided funds through sponsorship from his Moneytron concern, an investment firm that claimed to have a supercomputer able to predict the financial markets and deliver unlimited profits. But Van Rossum soon bought a controlling interest and became a co-owner. The paint job was an interesting choice, but the pieces were there for a decent debut season. The 32-year-old Swede had had a torrid 1988 in the dire Ligier, and when Onyx came calling with their resources and promising future, he gratefully accepted. Winding up at Ligier after being unable to find a top drive following his departure from McLaren, he would be hoping that this could be a ticket back to the top if he could be in at the ground floor of a successful new venture. He will certainly need to re-establish his credentials after having been somewhat outperformed by Arnoux at Ligier. His father was a French EEC official, his mother was German, and he was born in Luxembourg. Gachot is a truly international man, and has indeed always claimed his nationality simply as European, though he races on a Belgian super licence in deference to his chief sponsor. Starting in karts, he attended the famous Winfield Driving School at Paul Ricard, coming second to Eric Bernard in his year and missing out on the scholarship into Formule Renault. Instead, he dropped out of his university studies to enter British Formula Ford 1600, winning the 1985 championship with Pacific Racing, with whom he then moved up to FF2000 and won 6 victories in a season-long battle with local boy Mark Blundell to take the title. That won him sponsorship from Marlborough into F3 with West Surrey Racing, where he was runner-up to Johnny Herbert in the 1987 championship. In 1988 it was F3000 with Spirit, where he found it tougher going with just 2 second places on his way to 5th overall. But that was still enough to get him noticed by Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, whose investment scheme was attracting money from all over, including several Belgian royals, and who wanted a Belgian driver to sponsor into F1. Rial had had a solid debut season, but with Gustav Brunner having fallen out with owner Gunter Schmidt, now where have we heard that before, it has fallen to Stefan Fober to design the new chassis with input from Bob Bell and Martin Goodrich. The ARC2 is based on last year's, which isn't a bad base to start from, adapted to fit the updated Ford DFR engine, and many of the components remain the same too. As Ligier showed last year, innovation can backfire, but staying still can be the equivalent of going backwards in F1, and it remains to be seen how things will go for the Germans in 1989. They do have, for the first time in quite some time, an all-German driver lineup in the shape of the experienced Christian Danner, returning from a year in touring car racing, and youngster Volker Weidler. After 3 seasons in Formula 1 with little to show for it, Christian Danner had decided at the end of 1987 to leave Zakspeed and go into touring car racing instead, just like his 1987 teammate Brundle, who'd moved to sports cars. Competing in the Deutsche Tourenwagenmeisterschaft, the DTM, with the Alpina team, he'd won a couple of early races before dropping off a little in form, finally finishing 11th in the series. A move to Rial promised to give him a more competitive car and a second shot at F1. Born near Heidelberg in 1962, Weidler's racing career began in 1982 in a German Formula Ford 2000, followed a year later by 3rd place in the German F3 series, which got him a spot on the Volkswagen Works team. 1984 was a busy year, competing primarily in German F3, at which he took the runner-up spot to Dane Kurt Team, but finding time for the odd entry in British and European F3 championships and the Macau Grand Prix, where he came 4th from 17th on the grid. a race which his teammate, another Dane, John Nielsen, won from starting 4th. In 1985, Weidler finally won the German F3 title from yet another Dane, Chris Nissen, and started doing some sports car driving with Jost, another string to his bow he would develop the following year as he entered some WSC races, Formula 3000 with Bromley Motorsport to limited success, and DTM, coming runner-up in the latter to his old nemesis Kurt Team. For 1987 he decided to concentrate on the sports cars and drove for the Kramer Porsche outfit alongside Chris Nissen, which started well with a 4th and a 2nd, but went downhill from there, ending up 19th in the standings. He drove some more races for them in 1988, but got a full-time F3000 drive with the successful Onyx F3 team. Only their F3 success hadn't translated well to F3000, and Weidler struggled to 15th place with 5 points. Still, Rial were looking for a promising German youngster, and he'd made a name for himself as a gritty, determined driver who was very flexible and able to adapt to circumstances. AGS's 1988 season had been deeply frustrating. A clearly fast car and a clearly talented driver let down by the usual finance-induced reliability issues, and then, of course, their chief sponsor Bouygues pulled out, leaving owner Henri Julien in a big financial hole. In the end, he had to sell out to Cyril de Rouvre, a French businessman who had inherited 38 companies, a sugar refinery and huge tracts of land when his father was murdered by his own valet. He was a keen racer and had just launched a political career as well. So with all that turmoil behind the scenes, it's perhaps unsurprising that AGS won't have their new challenger, the Claude Galopin-penned JH24, ready for the start of the new season. So Team stalwart Philipp Streff and new boy Joachim Winkelhock will start with the modified 1988 car. Streff had struggled valiantly with the AGS in 1988 after a successful 1987 with Tyrrell, and had particularly impressed at the Canadian Grand Prix where he qualified 10th and mixed it with Nelson Piquet for 4th before breaking down. At the next race in Detroit, he even succeeded in passing the reigning champion before breaking down again. He was hoping that the 1989 car would not be as fragile. Younger brother of the late Manfred Winkelhock, Joachim started racing at 19 in Renault 5s and was progressing through the junior formula in Germany when the tragic death of his brother in 1985 seemingly brought his career to a halt. After 2 years out and older than many of his cohorts at 28, Joachim returned to the cockpit in 1988 and won the German F3 title with 4 victories and 3 second places. Under normal circumstances, Winkelhock would move up into F3000 to gain more experience, but he felt the clock was ticking, and with an offer to move straight into F1 from the expanding AGS team, he took the plunge. Lamberto Leoni had 5 F1 entries as a driver in 1977 and 78, posting 3 failures to qualify, 1 failure to start, transmission failure on the grid, and a retirement for his pains. Founding his own team, he moved into Formula 3000 for the 1987 season, when he shared driving duties with Gabriele Tarquini, and the pair finished joint 8th in the International F3000 Championship in March Chassis. For 1988, Pierluigi Martini took 4th place for the team, with Marco Apicella joint 8th, as Leoni took a desk job, and by 1989 he was ready for another tilt at F1, this time as an owner rather than as driver. With Richard de Vila designing the car, things looked promising, only for the Brazilian to leave during winter testing, disowning the design and saying it was not fit to race. Nonetheless, the team decided to give it a run out anyway, with Gabriele Tarquini at the wheel at the Attilio Betteja Memorial Race and the Formula 1 Indoor Trophy, and decided to enter using the Judd CV engine. Tarquini had endured a trying season in the sluggish Coloni, with 8th in Canada being a high point, but one of only 8 starts and 3 finishes. Quite a lot of the time the car was the worst car on the track, failing to pre-qualify on 7 occasions. Gabriele undoubtedly has talent, still searching for a place to show it though. Early signs are that the first may not be that place either, but with a previous association with the team, he will at least fit in.